And so one thing that helps to talk about this conversation of being a prophetic witness or having a prophetic imagination, I think, is tracking contemporary Christian music over the last 30 years and the
Right.
conversations that those songs were having. And so,
Okay. Okay.
you've got, I think in the 80s and 90s, it was like a subculture that was upholding a certain ethic in light of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so you had Michael W. Smith and, Amy Grant, who are like the Barbie and Ken of the Christian world, right? And they were like upholding this. We need to be different in our subculture. And then you have the youth group bands of DC Talk being like, it's us and them. We don't care what you think. We're Jesus freaks. But you move into the early 2000 and it was like, this idea that, we lived within Charles Taylor's immanent frame, there's nothing outside of your five senses. It's just all material. And then you get these Christian artists, I think, getting it where they're like, no, 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 we need to remind people that there's more to that. And so you have these songs coming out that were literally saying this and they were huge hits. So you had like Stacey Aurica, I don't know if you remember her, but there's got to be more to life than chasing down every temporary high. And then you had Switchfoot saying like we were meant to live for so much more. POD, I feel so alive for the very first time. It's like there's more to life going on. I think actually it's almost quite sad to kind of track how that went for the next 20 years after that, where I think there was just a blur, and then you get, artists actually folding into this therapeutic spirituality and not having the conversation very well. If we were to look at our time now and be like, well, what are the main messages? I think, well, we are highly politicized all of a sudden. We're not able to stay at the table with people that we disagree with, exactly what you're saying. So I do wonder, as a response to what it might mean to have some really important conversations right now. Two of the big things could be otherness, which you just mentioned. Like, how do I hold someone who's diametrically opposed to me on a whole bunch of issues and not treat them as my enemy, or love my enemy if you want to use Jesus' words?
Mm.
And then also, I think, what does it mean for us to frame power well theologically and not just see it as problematic or to just throw your weight around because you can? What does it mean to have a Christ-shaped power? And so, again, this is where Brueggemann's good. He's like, you need to do this without adopting a royal consciousness of we don't need to think about the suffering in those that don't have anything.
Will time be an enemy or a friend of mine? When I stand upon the threshold of that ancient rite, when I finally glimpse the fading light, will I bless or curse you?
Kia ora koutou and welcome to Lunch on the Way. Today, Graeme and I sat down with four-time repeat guest Sam Burrows, and we talked about a lot of really good things. We talked about the growing trend in people wanting to explore the Christian faith, especially those who are younger, coupling that with also an attraction towards the political right, and also about the imagination and how we need to reimagine reality from a biblical perspective. And that's not necessarily static and rigid, but invites us into a level of participation. And we explore a bunch of other things as well. Sam is a great conversation partner. He's such a great guy to have on. I'm really happy to be able to call him a friend, and he's given us his time for the next hour. If you are listening to this podcast, thank you so much for listening and being a faithful listener. If you want more people to know that this podcast exists, then leave a comment and review on whatever podcast app or platform you're using. And if you're listening on YouTube, hit like and comment or subscribe. It just helps the algorithm know that this is something people are interested in. Also, the music you're listening to is by my friend Josiah Davis, whom you can find him on Spotify. Hope you enjoy this episode today with Sam Burrows.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. So, what is this? This is like the fourth. This is the fourth time you've been on the podcast. You are by far and away our most frequent guest.
Some would question that decision, but I'm certainly very grateful to be here. You're continuing to put food on my table, so that's great.
Yeah, with our per diems. Now we don't give you anything, do we?
No, just a pat in the back, but it gets me through.
Well, it's very ambiguous, that statement, Sam, and I just thought, oh, that was kind of nice. That could have been taken quite another way, but actually, no, we don't give you anything, but that's where it's going.
No, we're just building your platform, right, Sam? Just building your reach.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're giving me what is it? Yeah. yeah, influence points or whatever. And so
We're
I'm sure that's great.
we're going from pillars to platforms. We're reversing it.
Yeah, thank you. That's why I disagree with Mark Sayers' book because I'm like, nah, man, I want that platform.
No, give it to me. Yeah, nice
Oh, have
sneakers
you read his
too.
book? Have you read his latest book?
No, because I disagree with it.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay.
No, no, I don't. I
Oh, he's
don't.
joking.
Let's definitely not keep any of this in.
No, no, no. We're just warming up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so I kind of want to start somewhere else because just to hear what you're saying, what you get a sense of what you're sensing in Australia.
Mm.
So this one study in the UK, which I'm sure you're aware of, the Bible Society put out about, the growth within Generation Z, within church attendance, how it's basically quadrupled, roughly speaking, within at least the male population below the age of 30, which is insane. Like who saw that coming, right? But at the same time, everyone's like taking that and being like, see, look at this, look at this, look at this. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. I think it's really good to have hope and to have empirical evidence of what people are experiencing and all that wonderful stuff. But what's your sense within, I guess, the shift now in Australia? Because you've been in Australia for about 2 years,
Nearly a year and a half.
nearly a year and a half. Okay. And you're within different church networks and Christian networks within the school system there. And
Yeah.
and you I find you generally have a good pulse on what's going on, or at least you talk to people who do. So what was your impression of that study when that came out? Like what were you thinking about?
Yeah, well, we've been talking about this together, us guys here, for a couple of years now about some of the shifts going on. I remember, 2 years ago, I think I jumped on this podcast and we were talking about, there's actually a move towards, seems to be something else away from what expressive individualism or something like that, whatever you wanted to call it, away from the postmodern to the metamodern, that kind of conversation. So I thought, even 2 years ago, we were talking about this kind of, there's something else emerging. And so I can't say I'm that shocked about it. So I mean, you got Justin Briley's podcast,
Yeah.
The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And while I totally agree with him, I just think that is a part of a much bigger phenomenon, which is meaning is back, and people are kind of wanting something a little bit more solid than what has been provided. Now that's creating massive opportunity for serious conversation around Christianity because 10, 15, 20 years ago, Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, all those guys were, making particular arguments that if you were to believe in God, you're essentially at a kindergarten level of meaning making. And now, even just the uptake of public intellectuals that have gone the other way shows that I think Christianity is not just seen as a serious intellectual option, but for many it seems to be the best intellectual option. And so you got people, I guess, like Peterson and Douglas Murray and Tom Holland and Ian McGilchrist who are making moves in their work, which is like you guys are pretty close to accepting the necessity of transcendence. You don't maybe quite want to go the full way of being like, yeah, there was a resurrection, but what do you do with that? But there's something shifting there, so it means that conversations have shifted. Yeah, so we could go on and on about that. And there are good things and bad things. There are opportunities and there are new challenges that are emerging in that.
That's a good thing you brought up because I did forget that we had that conversation around whatever that first one is to a meta modern, postmodern to meta modern. And I remember that was the first time I heard that term.
Mm.
And it makes me feel pretty good, Sam, that we were kind of had our finger on the button a little bit, before everybody else. I like getting there first.
So not we want to because I think you want to talk. We want to talk about imagination a little bit and the education
Yeah.
thing, which is I'm keen to go to. But just when you think about these changes to this meaning making and the shift that's happened in the public space and public intellectuals, and I know I'm aware of those ones because I listened to some of that too. Um, what do you think? Do you think the environment has certainly the environment, the political environment has changed? Is this anxiety that's sitting underneath here, the sense of loss in the kind of material consumption world? What do you think are the levers here that are pushing this drive for a greater meaning
Um,
that puts Christianity back in on the meaning making possibility shelf?
Yeah, look, I think there are lots of people throwing around different hypotheses about that. One of
Yeah,
them is simply every generation rebels against the one that's come before, and so
absolutely. Yeah.
if the millennials were quite atheist, the Gen Z is like, well, we're not going to be like that. We're going to get into God
Mhm.
again. So there may be an element of that.
Yeah.
But I do think collectively, there's just only so long you can sustain a sort of deconstructive, nihilistic, ultimately mentality around meaning before it starts to just people just get over it. Like honestly, I just think it was a gut sort of we've had a guts full of this, and so. Um, and I mean, there's more we could say. I think a lot of that is connected to the socio-political or just the political left. So we could get into that, and where it's sort of, I guess, the postmodern left-leaning ideas have basically gone further than they should have in some respects. So I don't. Again, I'm happy to go in any direction here, but I think that's been a big thing is the what happened to the left question.
Well, I remember I was listening to a podcast, I think, on the way to work today, and it talked about how this guy, he's a Christian, he knows other Gen Z Christians who are lying to their parents that they're going to brunch with their friends or going to like hanging out with their friends on Sunday morning, but instead they're going to church.
Funny.
You know what? And I was just like, what the heck? I'm like, that is just because like their parents wouldn't approve of them going to church because they're, postmodern, deconstructive type Gen X people, like parents. And I'm like, man, that is just such a difference. So I was thinking, man, it's like Christianity is punk
Yeah.
rock essentially for that generation. And there's the growing appeal of like, man, I'm really sticking it to my parents by being more conservative in my beliefs and values and how I view my life and actually having a guiding compass and direction in life and actually worshiping a God who they don't worship. I'm like, which isn't, in some ways isn't always necessarily the best perspective to have is to rebel against your parents. And
That's an individuation. So I mean,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
but at the same time, I'm like, you know what? Even when I was a kid, like I became a Christian when I was 11 or 12, and even then, like the culture predominantly was just very, very against Christianity in the 2004, especially into 2015. And I remember thinking to myself, am I just contrarian? Like, do I just like to not do what other people are doing? Is that why I'm a Christian?
Mm.
And I think there was an element, not entirely, but there was an element of like, I don't trust what everyone else just blindly believes. There's got to be something else going on here. And for me, that was a little bit rebellious.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've seen online people using the phrase "Christ is King" or "Christ is Lord" as almost like a way of saying "stick it to the man" or "stick it to culture." Just been like they're just saying, and so that's really interesting to me because at that point, if you're using the gospel in that way, you've already actually stepped away from what the gospel is. And so it's begun to be weaponized in a way it was never intended because it's being seen and being embedded in a context which is very different all of a sudden. And so people are like, yeah, like we told you, yeah, woke culture, take it, and all that kind of stuff. You're like, oh, okay, well,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, there's stuff we could say that I think there's sort of two actual big things that have happened to the left that have kind of opened up this sort of space.
Go for it. What are them? What are they?
Okay, well, to preface this, um, Jaguar, the the car brand, the car make,
Yes.
they released a an ad at the end of last year, which was hilarious. I mean, you can go online and see it. It's just a whole bunch of um, strangely trendy people posing in various stances, and it's all about individuality and expressing yourself. And it's just want to bang your head against the wall. It's not Jaguar. It's them trying to have some sort of message about whatever. And it's funny because 10 or 15 years ago, if it was released, it probably would have been received quite well. But it was released last year, and the response to it was hilarious. It just got torn to shreds. You had people say, oh, you had the Daily Mail saying something like, "This is the latest example of woke virtue signaling, transparent stuff," and then someone being like, I don't own a Jaguar, but if I want to sell the one that I own, or something like that. So it's hilarious stuff going on. Just really seeing through this whole kind of progressive cultural mood that we've been sitting in. And so something has shifted there. So I think the one of the main things is that there's been this massive overreach, I think, from the cultural left. So not the political left, the cultural left. And so you've got the voices that young people are listening to are people like Peterson, but also people like Matt Walsh, Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, even. You got people like that, and so you've got these people online that are sort of being a bit of a voice of reason according to these young people. But you've had articles come out. I've got a couple in front of me. A blog post article that came out about why we should abolish the family. The family is a conservative project that limits human flourishing. The family must be abolished. Another article saying the unbearable whiteness of hiking and how to solve it. And so there's this sense of which, like, I'm sure there's good parts in there to be aware of, but the point, you just can't go on pointing holes and deconstructing everything. So I think, there's a bit of an overreach, and I think people kind of have begun to see through it. But I think the main thing that really was a bit of a killer blow in the last couple of years is that the left kind of stopped talking just about domestic issues, so identity, sexuality, gender, that sort of stuff that pertain to the individual at home. And it started to wade into the more global scene. And so when you had Ukraine and Russia kicking off, and then you had Israel Palestine, it became very unclear which side we were supposed to be supporting. It was like, well, who are the indigenous? Who are the colonizers? Who are the oppressors? Who are in the wrong? It's actually incredibly complicated in some of these situations to be able to make a strong case. And the left kind of fractured at that point. It couldn't agree which side it was on. And so there was no unified left at that point. And since there was no unified left, there was no sense of knowing what it was even talking about. And I think this is a little bit reflective in the campaign of Kamala Harris. And I think, you get the sense, and I'm making massive generalizations here, that the people that voted for her were basically voting for her because they were voting against Trump, not necessarily because she had a very coherent message, very consistent messaging going on. And I think, the Democrats are very much in the space right now where they're like, who are we? What do we believe? And how do we need to message in order to become a viable option again? I think there's a massive identity crisis going on, which is a little bit reflective over the whole thing. So I think, yeah, there's been this overreach, and there's also been this move from domestic to global, which has confused the entire message of what's going on there. And I think in the chaos of all that, the right were able to basically show all the inconsistencies quite easily, and then step into something else. But I think for Christians that have been quite vocal about some of the critiques of the left for a long time, they may have feel tempted now to be like, yes, our side won. And I think that's very dangerous because
But yeah, I was going to
actually,
say that because could what we're getting, we've seen, that reveal itself, the Canadian elections and the
yeah,
Australian elections. What you've seen is that actually that swing to the right,
yeah,
and which then you've got the ARC conference and the kind of association with the Christian right, um, it could undo itself.
yeah. I think there's a big temptation, that I would be very wary of, which is to equate conservatism with Christianity. And I
Yeah.
think, no, that wouldn't be news to us, but
Mm.
I've certainly noticed it more here in Sydney than I did in New Zealand of the temptation to equate the two. So that's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. I know I was really surprised. I won't say give any more information than this, but I came across someone in their early 20s who was a female who said they listened to Charlie Kirk. And I was like, that blows my mind. Not because I agree or disagree with anything he has to say. To be honest, I haven't really listened to him. I just know who he is, and kind of where he stands roughly politically. However, I did not expect a young woman to say that she listens to him, and I was like, whoa, okay. So what people are listening to, not just men but women as well, who are younger, is very different to what even a decade ago people would have listened to. And I'm like, yeah, as Mark Sayers says, there's a vibe shift
Mm.
that's happened with the younger generation. And I guess maybe you can speak to this a little bit, and also maybe what I just said. there's also been this lack of like who are we, like who are we supposed to be, and now the left leaning political ideologies in that moment of like who are we. But for a long time there's been an attack and a deconstruction on what does it mean to be a man and a woman as well, or masculine and feminine, over for more than a decade.
Mm.
And one, listening to other podcasts and Justin Briley's podcast, and there is definitely a meaning hole, an identity gap within those demographics for younger people. Because if anything goes and I can define myself, that's actually really, I guess, unstable to stand on. So where should I go to help me understand who I am?
Yeah. And I think that was framed to young people like just pure freedom. Like you get to decide who you are, reach for the stars, write your own story, all that kind of stuff. I don't think what people maybe realize is that it became quite heavy. Like that's up to you now. You need to make something significant and meaningful out of your life. So, because everything about you that's meaningful has to be constructed. I mean, that's a heavy burden. So instead of like, a Christian faith that tells you you're actually defined by being in relationship to God. Like the primary thing that defines you is that you are in relation to Him. And so everything you are has been given to you, even on a relational level. Like we are made up of the relationships to others and in the world. Like we're the idea that we're that's just this enclosed individual is just a complete myth. Um, and so I think that's been quite heavy for young people to like, be a man and be whatever you want to be. It's like, well, someone please tell me. And so it's created that vacuum, and that's why you have voices like Andrew Tate coming in because at least someone's saying something about what it means to be a man. Now it might be like this toxic, domineering, hyper masculine, testosterone fueled, misogynistic idea, but at least it's something. You know,
Yeah.
that's what the vacuum creates.
And so you want to say something, Graham?
Yeah, because I'm kind of keen to go to a little bit of where the imagination was going, so I didn't want to sort of go down the political thing too far.
Yeah.
I think the only thing I was thinking about was this the fluctuation between left and right, the dangers of that.
Mm.
So you kind of get this association with right Christian, and it flicks that way, and then you can almost see it flicking the other way in reaction again if it's weaponized.
Mm.
So, I mean, this is quite a challenge. And I guess there's a little question there for me where what you're finding in your work, how you're navigating that, and how you navigate that in the sense that, um, like Douglas Murray and some of those ones. I mean, they say some really good stuff, and the art conference too. There's this danger of that kind of coagulating, bonding together in a way that actually we've missed the point.
Yeah.
How you navigate this, I don't know.
Well, I think having these conversations just out loud is super helpful. And I've been really actually quite impressed by the schools in the network that I work for because
Hmm,
I've sat down with a number of them and had this conversation. They'll get it. But I think we just all have blind spots. I have blind spots. You have blind spots. I think New
hmm,
Zealand sometimes can just imagine the rest of the world as a giant New Zealand, and so we have blind spots. And
hmm.
I think that kind of is really, really that dynamic's really good. So I think, you know, just even asking the question, what are our blind spots here is a really healthy one. But yeah,
So
I think imagination is a good place to go now.
yeah, yeah. So we want to talk a little bit about the imagination, and I'm sure it will connect in with what we've just said in some way. We can be imaginative and try and do that ourselves. But you've been thinking about the imagination for a little while, and you said you've been reading some Walter Brueggemann and the prophetic imagination. Graham did his PhD looking on media ecology, but that played a little bit into imagination as well, in imagining spaces. My PhD is also in imagination adjacent through metaphors, and how we actually the world that we live in is a world that is very much translated through our imaginations, and that's how we understand the world. So what have you been reflecting on, Sam, around the imagination, and kind of how that might actually be grounded in something concrete within our lived experience as Christians?
Yeah, I mean, I think it links really well with what we've been talking about. It's like, well, what is, where do we stand if the left and right keep, barging up against each other? Where do we actually stand? And I've recently rediscovered Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination,
Oh yeah,
which is
good one.
a classic. And I think, I don't know about you guys, but when you hear the word prophetic, sometimes you can get a little bit triggered from your, charismatic upbringings. Is someone going to run in here and start waving a ribbon around? I don't know, but um, I think what's really good about Walter Brueggemann is what he's saying is, throughout the whole book is actually protect your consciousness, protect your imagination in light of all these ongoing conversations. So I've actually got his definition of a prophetic imagination in front of me, and I think it's a good place to start, where he says, it is the task of prophetic ministry to bring the claims of the tradition and the situation of enculturation into effective interface. That is, the prophet is called to be a child of the tradition, one who has taken it seriously in the shaping of his or her own field of perception and system and language, who's so at home in that memory that the points of contact and incongruity with the situation of the church and culture can be discerned and articulated with proper urgency. So, to break that down, what he's saying is we need to be so at home and embedded in the narrative and the tradition and the story that we're part of, so that when we see points of contact with that in culture, we can see it and discern it and actually articulate it in a way that shows the urgency and the relevance to the everyday life. And so, again, if we come back to that conversation that we're talking about, of like, where does the church sit in all this tussling? Well, we need to plant ourselves on the rock and a whole bunch of sands of change, if you like, and actually remember who we are, and hold on to this, what Brueggemann would say, an alternative consciousness, to say that we're not being dragged into these dogfights and taking sides with the left and the right. We've always maintained some sort of difference to that, and we've got to. It's not difference for difference's sake. It's a certain type of difference in all of these changes.
Mm. I remember a lot of my research has gone into reading some postmodern theorists in the 20th century. And I know for a long time, within my Christian upbringing and discipleship, it like postmodernism bad, modernism good. And that was basically it. Then I started reading and I'm like, actually, no, what they rightfully point to something that is true, but I think their application is not necessarily there. And so what they point to that's true, broadly speaking, without getting into specific names, is that actually all of life is faith. Like there's everything that you do is exercising faith and trust in something you don't know with certainty. And so what they, move into is a type of nihilistic expression of that, of like, well, then there's no truth. It's like, well, no, 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 no. And then so the Christian faith, with you, what you said around the imagination is, all right, in a world of competing truths that are out there and different ways of imagining the world and scripts to pick up and live by, the Christian faith says something particular, and everybody's living by faith, but we all need an authority to live by and an imagination that guides us. And so what you're saying is, or what Brueggemann is saying is, you need to express faith and trust in the biblical authority, tradition, and story, and allow that to be the guiding narrative within your life.
Yeah, and continue to be troubled by scripture because of it, I think, and not just co-opt it into your own ideas, but actually sit with it and be like, oh, what Jesus said really makes me uncomfortable there. That's good. You're listening. The
Yeah.
moment where it starts to just all become comfortable, you're no longer listening.
Couple of things here. I'm kind of a bit of a fan of Brueggemann because I did a paper with him. That's a bit of a boast, I know, but it does kind of highlight.
You've just totally won this conversation.
Sorry, yeah,
Did you
but
shake his hand?
yeah, I did, and I talked to
Uh,
him. But anyway, long and short,
How long did the anointing last?
You guys are awful. Hey, listen, I mean, but in doing that paper, that what you were saying was, and I just actually quickly turned to a passage. This notion that Scripture ruptures
Hmm.
the status quo, and an example of that would be, because I use this, familiar with this passage because I used it in an essay that I wrote. But Isaiah 41, the latter part of that. And what you get this is that sort of they're in Babylon, so that this is the way life is. But if you read that passage in the latter part, I think it's from about 21 through to the end of the chapter. The text actually breaks that whole the whole narrative, the whole meta narrative of a Babylonian worldview, and it's mocking. It's absolutely mocking. Wheel out your idols. Tell them to talk. Ha ha, they don't talk.
Mm.
It's really a counter um, not just a counter narrative, but it's language that breaks, it smashes in against hard against a kind of these deep-seated presuppositions we have about, or the narrative we have about the culture. So I just need to consume more, or actually, if I push further to the right, this is the answer. This is going to solve our problems. It's a political, and that's the temptation when you do listen to this stuff. You sort of think, oh yeah, so this notion that the prophetic imagination is very much us finding ourselves in the text, which leads me to this point that I want to make, is that communities of faith, I think there's some thinking that needs to happen around communities of faith as communities of discernment. We have to I wonder whether, put that as a question rather than as an imperative, but I wonder whether as communities of faith we have to refigure what discernment means for us. And that distills down into some very, very practical practices that
Mm.
we've lost. The art of learning to listen to the other, to disagree with the other, and to stay and to hold in that space. So I don't know what you think to that, but is that sort of how can you see any of that kind of thing happening in your place of work? And
Yeah, well, I think maintaining distinctiveness is like you've got different priorities at different times. And so one thing that helps to talk about this conversation of being a prophetic witness or having a prophetic imagination, I think, is tracking um, contemporary Christian music over the last 30 years and the
right,
conversations that those songs were having. And so,
okay,
you've got, I think in the 80s and 90s, it was like a subculture that was upholding a certain ethic in light of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so you had Michael W. Smith and, Amy Grant, who are like the Barbie and Ken of the Christian world, right? And they were like upholding this, we need to be different in our subculture. And then you have the youth group bands of DC Talk being like, it's us and them. We don't care what you think. We're Jesus freaks. But you move into the early 2000s, and it was like, this idea that, we lived within Charles Taylor's immanent frame, there's nothing outside of your five senses. It's just all material. And then you get these Christian artists, I think, getting it, where they're like, no, 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 we need to remind people that there's more to that. And so you have these songs coming out that were literally saying this, and they were huge hits. So you had like Stacey Aurica, I don't know if you remember her, but there's got to be more to life than chasing down every temporary high. So that more in life, and then you had Switchfoot saying like we were meant to live for so much more. POD, I feel so alive for the very first time. It's like there's more to life going on. So I think it was a real moment where we're having this conversation. Well, I think actually it's almost quite sad to kind of track how that went for the next 20 years after that, where I think there was just a blur, and then you get artists actually folding into this therapeutic spirituality and not having the conversation very well. But I think, if we're to look at our time now and be like, well, what are the main messages? I think, well, we are highly politicized all of a sudden. We're not able to stay at the table with people that we disagree with, exactly what you're saying. So I do wonder, as a response to what it might mean to have some really important conversations right now, two of the big things could be otherness, which you just mentioned. Like, how do I hold someone who's diametrically opposed to me on a whole bunch of issues and not treat them as my enemy, or love my enemy if you want to use Jesus' words?
um,
And then also, I think, what does it mean for us to frame power well theologically and not just see it as problematic or to just throw your weight around because you can? What does it mean to have a Christ-shaped power? And so, again, this is where Brigham good. He's like, you need to do this without adopting a royal consciousness of we don't need to think about the suffering and those that don't have anything. So, yeah, I think those could be really important things to have right now is can Christians speak well about otherness and power?
yeah, when you just mentioned that, I mean, it's like a community at a practical level coming around, sort of like John 13, and asking that question. So, how is power being played out here? And
Mm,
what would that look like for us? I mean, there's a literal washing of feet, but it's this notion of of God coming down and getting into the dust, into the dirt
Mm.
to lift up. So, so that's extraordinarily challenging. Um,
Totally.
really challenging. Um,
Especially when we've had like I guess a church culture that's been highly influenced by mega church culture,
yeah.
in which power has been probably mishandled a lot, and you've got the anointed man of God mentality where he can't be questioned. Whereas power is always meant to be used to bring someone else to maturity. And that meant laying yourself down for them for whatever they need to do. That I mean that's all of Paul's language. So I
Yeah.
just yeah.
And power is also quite, if you're talking about power, it's very distributed in the sense that there are all sorts of power.
Mm.
You could go to, like in any church, you know, you only need to look at the visuals to say who's the powerful,
Yeah.
who's so, and it's also acknowledging that power's not wrong. I think you're right there. And maybe the flip side of that is asking who's being empowered
Mm.
and
What
what for.
one image that always lasts like sticks with me, and I know it's a classic one, but just before Jesus's washing of the disciples' feet, there's a really quick line that can be missed where it says, as he was growing in power,
Mm.
he washed, I'm paraphrasing now, he washed his disciples' feet. So John's gospel sees power and Jesus ascending in power as he ascends to the cross. And that's a complete reversal of what power looks like, where his
Well,
throne
actually,
is the cross.
yeah, and interesting in that passage, because you know probably John's gospel perhaps better than I do, but I do know those words of anabino and kinobino, this idea of sending up and sending down. In that passage, the word I think anabino is used, if I've got the right Greek word, the notion of coming down. It's actually Christ is descending here in a sense. God is coming down.
Mm.
So I think that's a really interesting play on power.
Yeah, because I remember Jonathan and I and Graham were saying, well, if you have power, should you give your power up? And is that like the Christian response? And I think we concluded, we said, no, 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 it's not giving up your power. It's completely perceiving it like conceiving of it differently. And it's even more than just lifting others up. It's like actually seeing that real power is in serving and going low.
So
The
kind of
lower you
a kind
go,
of a
yeah,
kenosis, an emptying out. But then
yeah.
that can get really. I mean, I've talked about this a number of years ago in a brethren context, and so their pastoral leaders are often quite powerless, and that so that they go, well, it's not that we don't want to hear that, but actually we're actually disempowered. So it has to be thoughtfully nuanced in context.
Mm. That's right.
But it speaks to the imagination because you have
Yeah,
to
yeah.
imagine a
Well, that
world like that,
yeah, yeah.
right?
Um,
Yeah.
mm.
And the only way that that is actually imagined is, I would argue, is through the incarnation. Like that's the only way we can properly imagine it because somebody else had done it before us. Someone else embodied that way of being. God himself did. And and because of that, it not only opens the possibility for us to do that, but also it sparks the imagination, if we want to speak theologically, through God's grace in the Spirit to allow us to be able to follow in his footsteps quite literally in the life he led.
And I was just thinking at a really practical level that, and I mean, I'm throwing this out as ideas, so I'm not conclusive in this, but the notion of the imagination and community is as, say, you get that text like John 13, and then it's wrestled within a context and what plays out in that, and which has some sort of resonance with your wisdom literature. What is the wisdom here is found in the interplay?
Mm.
In the sense like it's almost like right and left. Who's right? Who's wrong here? Well, it's not a case of that. Actually, the wisdom's found in the community that's wrestling with the narrative that speaks by the Spirit into the space. Does this make sense? How
Yeah, I
you
mean,
do this, how you do this becomes
well,
another
I
level.
think it's interesting because Brueggemann argues he's like our culture is very good at implementing things. Like if you can imagine it, we can implement it. We can do anything we
Yeah,
put our minds
yeah.
to. He says the problem is actually not in implementation. We could probably sort that out easily. The problem is, can you actually imagine a different world?
Mm.
And you need to practice being able to imagine a different world. Can
Yeah.
you imagine a different political model, for example, where power is used differently to what it is currently?
Mhm.
Can you
Mhm.
imagine a different way of doing community and church where power and otherness is treated with something really important and special and done quite differently? Because if you can imagine it, most likely, because of who we are, we can actually implement that. We're pretty good at those things.
Well, there's a poll because I'm thinking of like what's the dominant metaphor within our parliamentary system of what it means to be a servant? And it is the prime minister. Like the first servant is a more literal way of translating that.
Mhm.
However, there's something, I don't want to get too, principalities and powers over here, but you know what? There's that intent of like within our political system of seeing the person who's in charge is the primary servant of the people, right? And that's a very Christian idea. However, that positional power is like no longer allows you to really see that metaphor for what it is, for like the power and the rupturing and the propheticness, if you will, of that imaginative way of being. And so there's something else at play that just captures our imaginations at like a
Mm.
visceral level that just kind of distorts even the goodness that we even try and intend to put out into the world through, you know, uh, uh, reconstructed imagination. Yeah, I'm just, and you know what? That's where I'm like, yeah, there is evil in the world. That's actually beyond myself. That's where I kind of get into that territory a little bit.
Mm.
But within your work, Sam,
Yeah.
within, what's SEN? What's the acronym stand for?
And Christian Education National.
Christian Education National. I was going to say network because, N is just like network in my mind for some reason. So Christian Education National. So you've been having a lot of different conversations with some people on your podcast, and I want to kind of pump the tires of that one a little bit because I've really enjoyed them. It
I
has
have a question. I haven't listened to them. Sorry, Sam.
Graham, come on, man. We got homework before these interviews, right?
I
You are no
know.
longer my fellow DJ.
I
Anyway.
promise I'll go and have a listen to them now.
But your audience is obviously Christian educators, right? And so that's who you're
Mm.
pointing. You have different guests on that point in that direction. But I still find it really helpful because the conversations are broad enough to make it more applicable than just teachers and administrators within the schools or students or whatever. But one conversation I really enjoyed and I did not expect you to have on was you can remind me of the guy's name, but
Christopher Watkin.
Christopher Watkin. And what was his book title? You remember?
Biblical Critical Theory, and it's one of the it basically seemed to have taken over the world. It was huge. So yeah, very stoked for him.
Because what it did for me, and maybe we can end with this conversation. What it did for me was because as I'm wrestling with postmodernity and seeing what's legitimate and what's not within that movement and what I should listen to and what should I throw out, that book was really helpful. Or at least that conversation, I read a little bit around it, was really helpful to be like, actually, there's elements of this push towards postmodernity that actually reflect a bit of a biblical disposition that is still deeply orthodox and holds to truth in a concrete manner. And that's what I really enjoyed. What did you think of that conversation? Like, what led you to kind of bring him on, and what were some of your takeaways from that conversation, if you can remember?
Well, he's kind of been around our network a little bit, which is really nice. So he's done a couple of things with our National Institute, and he's spoken at our conferences. So he's actually a very gracious, generous man. And as you could probably pick up from the podcast, just a very
Yeah.
lovely person, very humble, quite surprised by his own success. Yeah, I mean, why? I think because everybody's talking about this book, and it caused a bit of a stir. And I think the title itself probably. Unintentionally was probably quite provocative because critical theory has been, the recent big bad for Christians. Before that was postmodernity, before that it was evolution, before that was atheism, before that was heavy metal. I don't know, but critical theory has really been the big bad for the last 5 years or so. And so to call your book biblical critical theory, I think I've heard people say this. It may appear that we're kind of just absorbing the cultural trend. But what he's trying to do is not that at all. And I think it actually is quite similar to what Brueggemann's saying. So Brueggemann's saying you need to maintain an alternative consciousness. What Watkin is saying is actually, yes, we've had something like critical theory. It's not the same because that's why it's biblical critical theory, but we've had something like it in our bloodstream the whole time. And what critical theory does, in a very broad sense, is to look at discourses, look at organizations, and to ask the question, who's in charge and who gets to call the shots, who has the power. Um, and those kind of questions are happening all the time in Scripture. And the question is, well, because God is ultimately in charge, what is our role to be in this world? And so we have this kind of not detached, but sort of this distinctiveness. This sort of we have our own identity while we live in a broader society, which leads us to have a stance towards these things where we do ask some of the same questions. So there's a bit of a kind of like a shared thing going on there. Importantly, though, he's like, no, no, this leads to very, very different conclusions because we're not here to simply be different for different sake, to deconstruct for deconstruction's sake. We're not here to criticize for criticism's sake. We're here because we're asked to be a very distinctive type of people in a culture, like we've talked about, that goes back and forth between left and right and power and no power, between different discourses. And it's basically remember who you are, remember where you stand, because your whole perception towards culture needs to be maintained. So the book, I would say, is essentially a textbook on a biblical theology of culture. And it will be an important book for a very, very long time. Manages to go through so many different important core elements of Orthodox theology, while at the same time addressing things in culture. So in some ways, I'm sort of like, I almost wish it wasn't called biblical critical theory because when people stop talking about it, it won't be as pertinent. But I'd say, look, if you've thought about this book, if you heard this book being talked about, it is worth the hype and incredibly helpful to frame things on a bunch of different issues.
Just a bit of background for our listeners here. The Biblical Critical Theory by Chris Wadkin, published when?
I think 2021.
Okay, so we're just into the after the COVID, sort of in that sort of
Oh,
space.
2022. Yeah, 2022. Yeah.
Okay.
Just after COVID.
That I haven't come across them, but I will certainly follow that one up. Just as you were talking, though, it struck me as this cultural thing that we're in, and this is very Western because I'm not sure that we get this in your kind of indigenous Pacific cultures. I don't know, simply don't know because it's not mine. But this binary thing, this or that. So what I'm hearing you say that in this Chris Wadkin book, he's saying that actually transcend that these dynamics of binary dynamics, that we can go above them and say, actually name it for what it is. Actually, this is really not helpful.
Yes.
Which is a really interesting thing, even in the culture, how binary our culture is, and you hear, and I hear this in the journalism that plays out. In a very crude way, you'll hear Jack Tame saying, "Can you give me a yes or no?" And you're going, actually, we're actually framing this in a way that's not helpful because you're pushing people to you've got to be this side or that side. So what I'm hearing there is he's giving you saying something actually biblical critical theory, as you're saying, is actually helps us, the narrative helps us transcend above that, not to be caught into that vortex of the yes or no.
Yeah, and so he uses a word called diagonalization, which is just
Okay.
his way of saying. I mean, when I asked him about that, he was like, we've been doing this since Augustine, which is saying yeah, the word transcend is probably a correct one. Where he's like, in the book, you've got, do we focus on the collective or the individual? Well, in the biblical story, it's diagonalization where you move from one to the other. It's neither and it's both. The
Yeah.
same goes for strength and weakness, or strength in
Yeah.
weakness.
Yeah.
The same goes for is sin a collective thing that we're all caught up in systems of sin, or is it the individual's responsibility? Well, it's both. And so the whole thing about diagonalization is all the way through the book. So that's his word for that.
So, because another way of thinking is that, you hear that in the wisdom books. So, like the whole
Yeah.
issue of riches, you get this, it's almost contradiction. You're blessed if you're rich, but you're cursed if you're the rich are cursed. So, who's right? Actually, the Bible doesn't say that. So, what it does, it creates a a framework in which to move within.
Mm.
That the wisdom lies within that, what I think you're naming, diagonal, is it diagonalism?
Diagonalization.
Diagonalization. Oh, that's a big, yeah.
It's
Too
like
many, too many syllables.
Diagon Alley in Harry Potter. It's like Diagon Alley, and then he goes to the wrong place. Anyone remember that?
Diagonalization as in terms of two two
Well, it's going
two
like
kind of
this.
diametrically
Yeah.
opposed ideas, and that ambiguity or those dichotomies are actually helpful to us, not unhelpful to us.
Yeah. Well, it seems
That's a
like,
that's a really good insight, actually.
or
It's a really good
as I've been looking into John's Gospel, chapter 1, in the beginning, God, the Word was with God, Word was God. So Jesus is the Word, is the Logos who is unifying and holding up and knitting together all of reality, essentially. If we follow Heraclitus's understanding of Logos and paralleling that to John. And what I'm thinking is, well, that whole lack of this or that, either or option when it comes to those particular paradoxes is actually within the person of God himself, which is, okay, is Jesus man or is he God? And the church tradition says, no, 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 no. He's not 50 this or 50 that. He is 100% both. It's like a diagonalization between God himself into the world. And it's
Yeah.
like, and if that's actually the bedrock of the world at a reality perspective, then of course we should expect to see some diagonalization within our lived experience as well.
Yeah,
I mean, it's that uncomfortable place of actually you could say this when you start to play with that. I know, but I don't know.
Well, it's like I have, Lord, I have faith. I believe, but help my unbelief.
Yeah.
It's like that as well.
There's a humility that begins to play into the sense of one's being. You're going to say, Sam, and I jumped in. Sorry.
no, that's fine. I think, I've increasingly found thinking about logos incredibly helpful. And it's one of those interesting places because I think uh, last time, well, one of the last conversations we had is there was a movement towards order, like people are wanting more order. In a world that feels very chaotic, and that's a movement towards meaning. And one of the paramount places you find that in scripture is in the logos. Like, the logos is the structuring principle, the first principle of all reality that upholds all things, gives it its rationale, gives it its better reason. It's the pattern that runs through all reality. There's many ways you could talk about the logos. No one really knows what version John was using. We can kind of guess. But essentially it has to mean something like that. And then so you can imagine if you're a conservative and you're wanting theology to uphold an order in the face of what's felt like social chaos, this is very attractive. Oh, yes, Christ is the order. Excellent. I can hold on to that. What you've got to remember is that this order is a person, and this person enacted his logos being. I'm running out of language to really understand this, but in a way in which he poured himself out, and it was with his eyes on the lowly and those that had been crushed by these political and religious systems. So we can't just hold up order for order's sake. Basically, following Christ, therefore, into those places is the most logical thing to do, consistent with reality itself. It's not just being a Christian. It is when I live in a way that reflects what Christ has done, I am being a logical human being. And that's I think, a really big shift. It needs to be smack bang in the middle of that conversation as well. Is that we are not just here to uphold an order in face of chaos. We're up here to uphold a certain type of order that looks like him and sounds like him and cares about the things that he cared about.
Boom. That's a good spot to end on, Sam. That was a good summary. Thanks so much. Thanks so much. This has been really fun. I always love hanging out and talking with you, Sam.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, really good conversation, Sam. Really, really interesting. Give us some things for it. To come away with a book to read. So there you go.
Am I ready to die when death comes, oh thief in the night? Will my eyes eyes be brighter than they are today? Will I bless or curse you? Will I bless or curse you?